Before I begin, a brief note the way I always make it when I'm recounting a case I have read or heard about. The names you're about to hear are assigned for clarity. The real names were withheld in the files, and I won't disturb what was intentionally kept private. It started the way so many tragedies begin in this country, quiet, ordinary, and almost forgettable. The Desert Star Motel sat just off Interstate 40 outside Gallup, New Mexico, the kind of roadside place you don't remember once you're back on the highway. One story, doors facing the parking lot, a soda machine buzzing near the office, a neon sign that never held a steady glow. In summer, the heat would hang over the asphalt like a thin sheet of glass. In winter, the wind cut through the gaps under the doors and made cheap curtains breathe. In the early 1980s, a state trooper named Luis Ortega was dispatched there late one evening. A housekeeper had done what housekeepers do. She knocked, called out, waited, knocked again. The guest in room 6 hadn't checked out. The door was locked from the inside. No answer, no movement. It was the sort of call that rarely turns dramatic until it does. When the door gave way, the room offered up a stillness that felt wrong. The air was stale with the sour edge of liquor. The bathroom light was on, and in that narrow space, a man hung from a belt, his feet not quite planted, his body angled as if he'd made a last decision and wanted it over quickly. His name, according to the register, was Robert Keene. Middle-aged, quiet type, the clerk said, paid cash, kept to himself. On the table sat an empty bottle, a scatter of pills, and a sheet of paper with a few uneven lines, what looked like a clumsy farewell. Debt, failure, shame. The trooper read it once, then again, the way officers do when they are searching for any note of coercion. Nothing jumped out. The scene was ugly, but not unusual. In the report, it went down as a suicide. Another lonely death on a long road in a town that had already learned how to keep moving. The owner, Frank Delgado, cooperated fully. He had the look of a man who knew the rules of survival, agreeable, calm, the kind who answered questions before they were asked. He said he was shocked, but the words fell out of him with a practiced ease, like someone who had already rehearsed them in the privacy of his own mind. The room was cleaned, sheets stripped, bathroom scrubbed, the belt removed and discarded, the floor mopped until the tiles shone, the motel kept renting. And if the story ended there, you would never have heard it from me. But what the early paperwork never captured is the way evil can anchor itself, not always with theatrical violence, but with something smaller and more human. A lie meant to cover a sin, a death made to look like a choice, and a sentence spoken in fear that functions like an invitation. Years later, when fragments of this case began making their way through channels I pay attention to, the first thing that struck me was not the death, it was the pattern that followed. And patterns, especially spiritual patterns, matter. Room 6 became the room that people complained about, not because of the mattress, not because of the plumbing, because of what they felt. Employees said guests came to the office in the morning pale and restless, pressing a hand to their sternum as if something had been sitting on their chest all night. A few said they heard scraping sounds from the bathroom long after they'd turned out the light, like a chair leg dragged across tile. One woman who cleaned the rooms refused to go in alone. She said the mirror would fog from the shower, and for a moment, a second shape seemed to stand behind whoever was looking, just a suggestion, just enough to make your skin tighten. Law enforcement records show that over the years, more deaths happened there. A young woman struggling with addiction cut her wrists in that tub and left a note that read, like pure abandonment, no one will remember me. A man found dead from an overdose, officially an accident, until someone noticed a scrap of paper on the table with a few lines of despair written in a hand that looked unsettlingly similar to the first note from the early 1980s. Another man, sitting on the edge of the bed, put a handgun to his head. It was logged as self-inflicted, yet an investigator noted, almost as an afterthought, that the gunshot residue on the hand seemed inconsistent too little, like the scene was not as simple as the headline. None of that by itself proves anything supernatural. People die in motels. People destroy themselves when they are exhausted, trapped, and unseen. But a place can amplify what is already broken in a person. And sometimes that amplification is not merely psychological. When I speak about possession or infestation terms people like to throw around, I always return to something grounded, the fruit. What does the phenomenon produce? Confusion, isolation, compulsion, a tightening of the will, as if the person is being guided toward a single option and all other choices are quietly removed from the room. Room 6 produced that kind of narrowing again and again. Then, in the late 2000s, a woman named Emily Vargas checked in. Emily was a nurse from Albuquerque. She had the kind of professional competence that holds other people's lives together and the kind of private anguish that can make your own life feel unlivable. A divorce, a lawsuit tied to her work, and an unresolved grief that clung to her because a patient had died on her table and she could not stop replaying the moment, hunting for what she thought she did wrong. She drove without a plan, not wanting to go home, not wanting to see anyone, just wanting the world to be quiet. Desert Star offered quiet for a price she could afford. The clerk, Dolores, the owner's wife, handed her the key to room 6 as casually as you hand someone a receipt. Emily hesitated. She later said, not because she knew the history, but because the number felt strange in her palm. Dolores gave a half smile and said something like, if you hear people talking at night, turn on the television. Emily took the line as small-town humor, a tired joke, the kind of comment people make when they've lived too long alongside something they don't want to name. She went into the room, set her bag down, drew the curtains against the parking lot lights, and swallowed a sedative she had been prescribed. She sat on the bed, staring at the carpet and then at her hands, as if her own body belonged to someone else. The silence was thick. The air conditioner rattled. Somewhere outside, a truck idled and then pulled away. And then, in that silence, she heard thoughts that did not feel entirely like her own. It's hard to explain this to people who have never experienced intrusive spiritual oppression. They think of voices as something dramatic, but more often it is subtler, an interior suggestion that slides into your mind with the same texture as your own thinking, except it is smoother, colder, more confident. It offers itself as relief. No one needs you anymore. If you die here, it will be simple. Just another report. A dirty little room on a highway. No one will remember. It will be quiet. Emily stood and walked into the bathroom as if pulled by a string. She looked at the towel rack, then at the closet where a robe hung with a belt tied loosely at the waist. She noticed the hook behind the door. She noticed, with an odd clarity, the height of that hook, the distance from the floor, the angle at which a belt might pull. Her account said that at that moment she felt a presence close behind her, not a shadow on the wall, not a figure in the corner, but the unmistakable sensation of someone stepping into your personal space. She felt a hand, not gripping her, but resting on her shoulder with a kind of guiding pressure, as if someone were helping her position herself, the way a tailor adjusts fabric. She described a floating fatigue, the sense that resistance would take effort she no longer had. She lifted the robe belt, and that's when the illusion cracked. From the room next door came shouting, a man's voice, a woman's voice, the slam of something hard against a wall, glass breaking, and a woman screaming words that, in the files, were quoted because they mattered. Do not add more sin, Frank. Emily froze. The belt slipped from her fingers. The spell, if I can use that word, shattered, and she felt, all at once, the horror of what she had been about to do. She locked herself in the bathroom as if she were protecting herself from her own mind. Hands shaking, she found a crisis number she'd once seen on a pamphlet at the hospital, called it, and waited for a human voice to tether her back to reality. That call connected her to a Catholic volunteer on a hotline. The volunteer listened, asked the right questions, and did something important. She did not dismiss the experience as mere imagination, nor did she inflate it into spectacle. She told Emily to leave the motel as soon as she could safely do so, and she gave her the name of a priest serving a parish not far away, Father Michael O'Connor. Emily met with Father Michael the next day, exhausted, embarrassed, and still terrified at the moment she could not fully explain. She told him about the thoughts that felt inserted, about the bathroom, about the way the room seemed arranged for one final act, about the sense of someone behind her, guiding her posture like a coach. Father Michael had heard confessions of despair before. He had sat with depression, trauma, addiction, and grief. He knew the language of mental anguish, but he also knew that the spiritual life can intersect with psychological suffering in a way that makes both worse. Emily's story carried a specific mark: compulsion with instruction, not just sadness with impulse. He asked her where she had stayed. Room 6, she said. He didn't react outwardly, but something in him shifted, because he had heard that number before, from parishioners, from a local officer, from rumor, always rumor, that kept circling back to that same motel off the highway. Father Michael began to do what good pastors and careful investigators do. He gathered facts. He asked a parishioner who worked near the courthouse to help him pull public records. He looked at incident reports tied to Desert Star. He spoke to Trooper Luis Ortega, now a veteran officer who remembered the first death, the man named Keene, the belt, the letter on the table. The name Frank Delgado appeared again and again in those documents, not as a suspect, never as a suspect, but as a constant presence. The man who owned the building, the man who answered questions, the man who said over and over that he couldn't be responsible for the choices of people passing through. At first, you might think that statement is simply self-protection, a businessman refusing liability. But when you read enough files, you start to hear when a sentence is doing more than one job. Sometimes it is not just a defense, it is a confession disguised as indifference. Father Michael kept digging. Emily tried to return to her life, but the memory of that bathroom followed her like a bruise. She couldn't shake the certainty that something in that room had wanted her dead, not out of rage, but out of appetite. Then, one night, violence broke through the thin walls of Desert Star again, this time in a way that would force everyone involved to look directly at room 6, whether they wanted to or not. A young couple, Isaac and Jenna Moore, checked into a room nearby. They were arguing. Alcohol was involved. The kind of fight that begins as insults and ends as threats. Jenna fled into the night air, barefoot, looking for the office, looking for light, looking for someone to witness what was happening. In her panic, she ran to the wrong door. Room 6. The door was open because Dolores had just finished cleaning. Jenna stumbled inside, pushed it shut, and tried to breathe. Isaac followed. He dragged her away from the door. He yanked at the curtain cord. He wrapped it around her throat. He screamed something that wasn't just anger, but fear of consequence. If you die, I am finished, so we die together. Jenna, choking, turned toward the bathroom mirror. And in that mirror, she saw Isaac, yes, but she also saw something else positioned behind him, close, intimate, mirroring his movements, as if teaching him how to tighten the cord. A figure with a swollen, discolored face, eyes bulging with the pressure of a strangled death. A belt she swore like a belt at its neck. The image wasn't a full-bodied apparition. It was a convergence, a layered reflection, like two realities briefly overlapping. Isaac's hands seemed stronger than they should have been, the cord bit deeper. Jenna's vision narrowed. She managed to reach into her pocket and find a small knife. She stabbed blindly behind her, not aiming for a kill, only aiming for space. The blade caught Isaac's shoulder. He recoiled, lost his footing, and struck his head against the edge of the sink. Blood spread fast on the tile, bright and shocking under the bathroom light. When police and an ambulance arrived, Isaac was alive but badly injured. Jenna was bruised, trembling, and in a kind of shock that had nothing to do with the cuts on her skin and everything to do with what she believed she had seen. Trooper Luis Ortega walked into room 6 again after all those years. He saw the cord, half coiled, the blood, the fogged mirror, and something tightened in him, a memory of another body, another belt, another report that had felt routine until time proved it wasn't. He remembered an old remark from a colleague said, half as a joke, half as a warning, that room is cursed. Father Michael heard about the incident almost immediately. He now had Emily's account of spiritual pressure, the growing list of deaths, the repeat appearances of Frank Delgado in every file, and a violent episode in which the mirror itself seemed to testify. He prepared a report for the Diocese of Gallup describing what he believed was present at Desert Star, a malign attachment to a location, feeding on despair, intensifying compulsion, drawing people toward self-destruction and toward acts that could be staged as self-destruction. What Father Michael did not yet have, what no one yet had, was the key that would tie the entire knot. Because at the center of it all was that first death, decades earlier, the man named Keene. And Keene, as it turned out, had not chosen the belt. Someone had chosen it for him. And somewhere in the shadows of that motel's history, a sentence had been spoken, half oath, half plea, that did what careless words sometimes do. It reached beyond the speaker. It offered a direction. It opened a door. The next part of this story begins when a young reporter starts asking the wrong questions in the right town, and a woman who has stayed silent for too long finally walks into a confessional, carrying a secret heavy enough to crack the floor beneath room 6. What happened next did not unfold like a movie. It unfolded the way real darkness often does, through paperwork, whispered conversations, sleepless nights, and people who suddenly realize they have been living beside something they should have confronted years ago. A few days after the incident with Isaac and Jenna, word moved through Gallup the way word always moves in towns that sit between open desert and long miles of highway. It wasn't just that someone got hurt, it was where it happened. Room 6 had become a number people said softly, the way you say a name you do not want to summon. Father Michael O'Connor did what a prudent priest does when he suspects something beyond the ordinary. He documented. He separated what could be verified from what could only be described. He kept Emily's account in her own words. He requested copies of incident reports. He wrote down the details of Jenna's statement about the mirror, especially that peculiar element of instruction, of a presence mimicking the violence, almost coaching it. When spiritual evil is present, it rarely invents entirely new behaviors. It imitates, it parasitizes, it takes a human sin and amplifies it until it no longer feels human. Then Sarah Kim appeared. In the file I later read, Sarah was described in plain terms. Local reporter, ambitious but not reckless, working on a series about suicide rates in rural communities. She had been compiling data, coroner reports, police logs, county numbers, and one name kept showing up with an ugly frequency, Desert Star Motel. At first, it looked like a statistical quirk. Motels on interstates attract a certain kind of traffic, people in transition, people hiding, people exhausted, people broke. But when Sarah mapped the incidents, she saw something that didn't make sense. The motel wasn't just a recurring location. One room was. Room 6 appeared with a regularity that defied coincidence. Sarah did not start with demons. She started with common sense. She interviewed former employees, people who had cleaned those rooms, and lived to tell about the atmosphere that settled there after sunset. She spoke with emergency responders who remembered walking into room 6 and feeling, for no medical reason, like their throats were tightening. She spoke to a man who had stayed there one night and left before dawn because he said the bathroom had felt too ready for something, like it had been staged for a decision he did not want to make. She went to Trooper Luis Ortega next. Luis had the steadiness of someone who has seen too much and learned not to dramatize. But he couldn't hide his discomfort when Sarah asked about the original death in the early 1980s. He told her the facts, the belt, the note, the liquor, the pills. He told her how it had been logged. Then he paused, and the file noted this pause because Sarah noted it. Luis admitted that after returning to that room decades later, He felt something he could not put into an official report. Not fear exactly, recognition. It is one thing to enter a scene and feel sorrow. It is another to enter and feel that the room remembers. Sarah asked him if he believed the first death had been staged. Luis did not answer directly. He said only that the note bothered him now in a way it hadn't then. The handwriting looked wrong for a man about to die. The story of debt and failure was too neat, too generic, as though it had been pulled from a common script. And in the years that followed, he'd seen other notes from room 6 that carried the same flavor, the same cadence, the same despair arranged into tidy sentences. He had no proof, but he had instincts. And a veteran trooper learns to respect his instincts even when he cannot justify them to a courtroom. Sarah's next stop was the parish office. When she met Father Michael, she came with a recorder and a notebook, but she did not come as a skeptic looking to scoff. She came as a woman who had stared at enough grief to know there was more to it than headlines. Father Michael did not share Emily's story in full. He protected her. He spoke instead about how despair can become contagious, how certain places accumulate sorrow, how a community can become numb and start treating tragedy like weather. Sarah pressed him gently. Was he suggesting something spiritual? Father Michael responded with restraint, but he did not deny it. He told her, in careful language, that he had concerns about the pattern at Desert Star, and that he had forwarded those concerns to the Diocese of Gallup. He said that when a place becomes associated with repeated self-harm, the first obligation is compassion and practical help, but the second obligation is to ask whether something is actively pulling people toward death beyond the normal forces of human suffering. Sorrow left with more questions than answers. And that is when Dolores Delgado, the owner's wife, began to unravel. Dolores had lived beside Frank Delgado for decades. Whatever love had existed between them had long ago been replaced by endurance. In the background of the file, you could see her progression like a slow bruise deepening over time, excuses, silence, resignation, and then finally fear. After the incident with Isaac and Jenna, Dolores reportedly stopped sleeping. She began to jump at small sounds. She developed an aversion to mirrors. She kept her hands busy washing, folding, cleaning, like motion could keep the past from catching her. But the past caught her anyway. One evening, she came to confession. The priest who recorded it described her as pale and shaking, hands clenched around her purse as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She asked for Father Michael specifically. Confession is not a courtroom. It is not journalism. It is the place where a person finally stops negotiating with God. And Dolores, according to Father Michael's later notes, stopped negotiating that night. She told him the first death in room 6 was not a suicide. She said Robert Keene did not arrive alone in the story. He arrived with a briefcase of cash and a plan to disappear. He had been an accountant tangled in a petty embezzlement, trying to steal his way out of ruin. He had contacted Frank because Frank claimed to know people who could help with documents, new names, new papers, a clean exit. Dolores said Frank was already drowning then. Gambling debts, angry men, threats whispered outside the office door, the kind of desperation that makes a person think sin is survival. Keene and Frank drank in room 6. They argued. Keene, drunk and careless, let the money show. Dolores said Frank later described it to her with a kind of trembling excitement, the weight of the case, the smell of the bills, the sense that all his problems could be erased in a single night if he just took what was in front of him. Frank killed Keene with a belt. He didn't admit it as murder when he told Dolores. He wrapped it in language that made the act sound smaller than it was. He said Keene was asking for it. He said Keene was weak. He said he only helped the ending come faster. And then he did something worse than killing a man. He staged the death as a suicide. He hung the body. He wrote a fake note. He used his non-dominant hand to make the handwriting uglier and less recognizable. He cleaned, not to honor the dead, but to erase himself. Then he called it in and played the role of shocked owner. Dolores told Father Michael that what haunted her most was not the method. It was a sentence. Frank spoke afterward, half laughing, half panicked, as if he were trying to bargain with the universe. He told her he said something like this, leaning over the body while the room smelled of whiskey and sweat and terror. Keene chose his death. If anything out there is listening, it can cling to him, not to me. When Father Michael wrote this down later, he underlined the idea, not the exact wording, because exact wording is less important than intent. A person can speak an invitation without realizing it is an invitation. A person can throw blame like a stone, and sometimes the stone breaks a window you never meant to touch. Dolores said after that night, the motel never felt the same. Frank became harder, more careless, more cruel, and room 6 became a place he avoided unless he had to. He would send others to clean it. He would snap at Dolores if she lingered near the bathroom. Yet when the deaths began piling up over the years, he also displayed a chilling sort of contempt. He would shrug and say people choose what they choose. He would tell her it was none of their business. He would even hint that the motel's reputation brought a certain kind of customer, those who were drawn to darkness like a moth to a porch light. Dolores confessed that she hated him for that. But she also feared him, and she feared what he had brought into their lives when he committed murder and then tried to push the consequences onto the dead man's shoulders. Father Michael listened. He did not interrupt. When Dolores finished, she broke down in a way that sounded like a dam finally giving way, years of swallowing truth, years of watching strangers spiral in a room that should have been locked forever. She said, "I think we opened a door," and he kept pretending it only eats the ones who want to die. Father Michael did what he could do immediately. He urged her to seek legal counsel to protect herself and to understand that the civil consequences would now come. He also understood something else, something spiritual and urgent. A confession like this does not just expose a crime, it threatens what has been feeding on that crime. When the truth comes into the light, evil often reacts, not because it is wounded by morality, but because it is threatened by exposure. Secrecy is a favored habitat. Lies are comfortable furniture. When you start pulling them out into the open, the infestation doesn't politely retreat. It pushes back. Within days of Dolores' confession, Sarah Kim noticed a change at Desert Star. In her notes, she wrote that the motel seemed to sink into itself. The sign flickered more often. The office windows stayed dark. A man Frank was seen pacing late at night, smoking on the walkway, staring toward room 6 with a stare that looked less like ownership and more like wariness. Sarah tried to speak to Frank directly. She approached with professionalism, not accusation. She asked about the motel's history, about safety, about the number of incidents. Frank gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He told her suicides happen everywhere. He told her to mind her business. He told her to stop harassing his guests. But Sarah saw something then that she would later describe in a way that made the hair rise on my arms when I read it. She said Frank glanced just for a second toward the bathroom window of room 6 as if he expected something to be watching him from behind the glass. That same week, Trooper Luis Ortega received instructions to reopen the Keene case. Dolores' statement outside the confessional, given to authorities in a way that could be used, was enough to justify digging. The troopers pulled the old evidence logs. They requested archive photographs. They reviewed the original report for inconsistencies. And the inconsistencies multiplied once someone cared to look. The belt, the position of the body, the angle of the knot, the placement of the note, small things, details that can be ignored when you are tired and the case seems straightforward. But when you know murder is possible, details change their meaning. A staged suicide is like a staged prayer. Its goal is to mimic the surface while betraying the interior. Father Michael, for his part, contacted the diocese again, this time with a more direct warning. The spiritual pattern was tied to a criminal root. The evil in room 6 was not random. It was anchored by an act of murder disguised as self-destruction, and it had been nourished by years of repeated despair. That is when I became aware of the case. Not because I was in New Mexico. I wasn't. But within the community of priests who have been trained for this work, cases circulate quietly. Sometimes a diocese asks another for counsel. Sometimes a priest calls someone he trusts and says, "Here is what I'm seeing. Here is what I have. Tell me if it fits a known pattern." I had been appointed as an exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis in the mid-2000s and trained in Rome for this ministry. And with that comes an obligation to be cautious, to be obedient to the Church, and to take seriously any report that involves repeated self-harm linked to a place. Not because we want to chase ghosts, but because despair is one of the most effective weapons the enemy uses. It does not always need to frighten a person. It only needs to convince them that there is no point in living. When I read the summary Father Michael sent through the proper channels, one element stood out immediately: the consistent whisper that sounded like the victim's own reasoning, but cleaner, simpler, and aimed at one conclusion: death as relief, death as erasure, death as convenience. That is not proof of demonic influence, but it is consistent with it, especially when combined with the history of a staged suicide. Because something happens when a murder is dressed up like a self-inflicted end. Responsibility is shoved away. Guilt is hidden. The dead are blamed for their own murder. It is an inversion of truth. An inversion is a signature of the demonic. The diocese in Gallup began the formal process, and the process matters. The Church does not rush. She investigates. She consults medical and psychological professionals. She collects witness statements. She ensures there is no natural explanation being mistaken for a spiritual one. And if, after careful review, a spiritual response is warranted, it is done with permission, authority, and prayer, not bravado. Meanwhile, the motel did what many places do when they sensed the ground shifting beneath them. It tried to hold itself together with denial. Frank became more volatile. Dolores became more withdrawn. The staff quit one by one. Guests complained and left in the middle of the night, abandoning money just to get away. A truck driver reported waking up with his hands around his own throat, as if he'd been sleepwalking into strangulation. A woman said she heard someone in the bathroom whispering her name in a tone that was almost tender. And room 6 continued to do what it had been doing for decades, offering despair like a menu. The difference now was that people were finally paying attention. Sarah Kim prepared to publish. Trooper Luis Ortega prepared warrants. Father Michael prepared a spiritual case file for the diocese, including Emily's testimony and Jenna's statement and the newly uncovered truth about Keene. And if you want to understand the tension at this point, imagine a room that has been sealed for years, filled with smoke. The moment you crack the door, the smoke doesn't politely drift out, it surges. The closer the truth came, the heavier the air became around Desert Star. It was as if the place itself knew its secret was being dragged into daylight. The next phase begins when the diocese authorizes a priest trained and appointed for deliverance work to go to the motel, not to put on a show, but to do the quiet, disciplined work of prayer in a place that had been turned by human sin and human cowardice into a feeding ground for despair. And it begins, too, when Frank Delgado realizes that the story he staged decades ago is no longer under his control. Because the one thing evil hates more than prayer is the truth spoken aloud, especially in the very place where the lie was first told. In the months after Desert Star closed, people in Gallup did what people always do after something ugly is dragged into the open. Some wanted answers. Some wanted silence. Some wanted to turn it into a story they could tell at bars, because humor is how many people disinfect fear. And some, the ones who had stood inside that room and felt the air change, wanted to pretend they had never been there at all. But the truth does not stay put once it has been spoken. Frank Delgado's case moved through the system slowly, as most cases do when the crime is old and the paper trail is thin. Evidence ages, memories warp, witnesses die or move away. Yet there was a stubborn fact that refused to fade. Robert Keene had gone into that bathroom alive, and he had not come out. Trooper Luis Ortega sat through meetings that felt like they were built from dust and patience. He watched younger investigators handle the old photographs with gloved hands, not because the images were fragile, though they were, but because what they represented was a mistake made decades ago, written into a report, and then quietly accepted by everyone who needed life to keep moving. Louise carried a particular kind of burden. People think law enforcement lives for closure. Often they do. But there is another reality. Closure can mean admitting you missed something, and that admission can sit in your chest like a stone. Louise did not speak dramatically about it. He did not say he was haunted. He said he wished he had looked harder the first time. He said he wished he had asked one more question, held the note up to the light longer, studied the belt and the knot and the angle of the body with more suspicion, and then he said something that made its way into a memo because it mattered. He said he did not believe the evil at Desert Star began with the deaths that followed. He believed it began with a lie that covered the first one. That is how these things often work. A building does not become dangerous because someone suffers inside it. People suffer everywhere. A building becomes spiritually compromised when suffering is paired with sin, and denial when someone chooses to do harm and then refuses responsibility. When guilt is buried instead of confessed, when truth is strangled and dressed up as convenience. That is why stage scenes are not merely criminal. They are spiritual distortions. They train a place to participate in deception. They teach the air to lie. Sarah Kim's series ran in the local paper and then was picked up farther out than anyone expected. It wasn't sensational. It didn't lean on ghost stories. It leaned on numbers and faces. The lonely dead, the families who received calls at odd hours, the medical examiner who could not forget a young woman's hands because there were marks on them that suggested she had changed her mind too late. The sheriff's deputy who said he always felt sick walking into room 6, even before he knew it was room 6. Sarah wrote carefully about the spiritual claims. She quoted Emily without exploiting her. She described Jenna's mirror testimony without turning it into a carnival act. She included Father Michael's insistence that despair is not entertainment, and that anyone feeling pulled towards self-destruction should seek immediate help, because the first duty is to preserve life. That caution mattered. And it is the kind of caution that aligns with the Church's approach. People sometimes accuse priests of wanting to see demons everywhere. In reality, the responsibility of this work is to resist that temptation. A good priest is slow to label. He is quicker to listen than to pronounce. Still, the public read what it wanted to read. The motel became a landmark for the wrong reasons. A few thrill seekers drove by and took pictures from the road. A couple of teenagers tried to sneak onto the property one night and were chased off by a security guard who had been hired to keep trespassers away from a place that now carried both legal liability and spiritual dread. And then something more subtle happened. When a community begins to talk about a pattern of despair, people who have been silent start to speak. Not because they want attention, but because they finally have language for what they felt. A man who had stayed at Desert Star years earlier contacted Sarah's editor and said he had woken in the middle of the night with a certainty that he needed to end his life, even though he had never had that thought before. He described it as a calm instruction, like a voice explaining a task. He left the room, sat in his truck with the engine running, and cried until sunrise. He had never told anyone because he thought it meant he was weak. Reading about the pattern made him realize weakness was not the whole story. A former housekeeper told Father Michael that she used to find small notes in the trash from room 6, scribbles, torn pages like people were practicing goodbye letters and then thinking better of it. She said she would throw them away and whisper a prayer without knowing why. She said she had nightmares for years about a hook behind a door. Dolores Delgado, meanwhile, did not become a villain in this story, and she did not become a hero. She became what many people become when the lies they live beside collapse, exhausted and frightened, but honest at last. She moved in with a relative for a time. She attended counseling arranged through the parish. She came to confession more than once, because confession is not a single act for a life like hers. It is often a process of untangling. Some days she spoke with anger at Frank. Some days she defended him reflexively and then hated herself for it. Some days she just sat and cried because she could not stop thinking about the people who checked into that motel looking for rest and found a waiting for them. Father Michael did not offer her easy comfort. Easy comfort is rarely true comfort. He reminded her that guilt can become its own trap if it turns into hopelessness. He told her plainly that she had been complicit in silence, but that silence did not have to be her final decision. He told her she had done one of the hardest things a human being can do. She had admitted the truth after living in fear of it. That matters spiritually. Evil loves two things, secrecy and despair. When you pull something out of secrecy, you starve it. When you refuse despair, you deny it its favorite meal. Emily Vargas continued her recovery in a different way. She did not become an expert on demons. She did not start seeing darkness in every shadow. She did something far more difficult. She returned to ordinary life with a clearer understanding that her mind, under enough stress, could become vulnerable to thoughts that did not serve her. She resumed therapy. She joined a support group for healthcare workers grieving traumatic outcomes. She built a small routine that anchored her in daylight walking, prayer, meals at regular times, checking in with friends even when she wanted to isolate. And she kept one memory that she did not romanticize, the memory of her hand lifting that robe belt in a bathroom that felt arranged for her death, the memory of a voice inside her that sounded like relief, the memory of a shout through a wall that shattered the spell. That shout, she later said, might have saved her life. It was not holy music. It was not an angelic choir. It was the sound of human ugliness, an argument, broken glass, a woman yelling at a man for sin, and yet God used it. That is another thing people misunderstand. They imagine spiritual battles require perfect settings. In reality, grace interrupts wherever it can. It uses the tools available. A scream through drywall can become a lifeline. Jenna Moore and Isaac Moore did not reconcile. The legal system handled Isaac, and Jenna focused on safety, therapy, and rebuilding. She carried trauma in her body the way many victims do, tight shoulders, sudden flinches, a wary relationship with mirrors and closed bathrooms. But she also carried something else, a hard-earned clarity about how quickly violence can escalate when shame and alcohol and entitlement combine. Jenna refused the temptation to rewrite her own story into fate. She refused to say it was all destined, all cursed, all beyond human responsibility. She held both truths at once. A man chose to hurt her, and something in that room seemed eager to help him do it. That kind of complexity is difficult for people. They want one explanation that relieves them of the discomfort of mixed causes. But real cases are often mixed. The demonic does not replace human choice, it exploits it. It does not create sin from nothing. It inflames what is already there. When Frank Delgado's trial date approached, there was a moment recorded in the file that I found revealing. Frank requested a meeting with a priest, not Father Michael, someone else, someone he thought might be more neutral. The request was granted in a controlled setting. The priest who met with him later wrote a brief summary. Frank was not repentant in the way people hope for. He was defensive. He spoke in the language of minimizing. He said Keene would have ruined him. He said everyone was desperate back then. He said he did what he had to do. He said the later deaths were not his fault. Then, in a moment that chilled the priest, Frank admitted he had avoided room 6 whenever he could. He said the bathroom made his skin crawl. He said he couldn't stand the mirror. He said sometimes, late at night, he would hear a faint dragging sound like leather on tile, and it made him furious because it felt like someone accusing him without words. The priest asked if Frank believed in God. Frank said, yes, of course. The priest asked if Frank believed in evil. Frank hesitated, then said something like, I believe in consequences. The priest asked if Frank believed he had invited consequences into that room by shifting blame onto the dead. Frank laughed once, but it sounded brittle. He said, I said what I said because I was scared. That was the closest he came to truth. Fear does not excuse sin, but fear does explain why people bargain with darkness. They think if they can redirect the cost, they will be spared. They think if they can point at someone else, the universe will agree. It does not work that way. If anything, that kind of bargain is exactly what darkness waits for, an excuse to attach itself to a lie and keep feeding. Frank did not confess fully. He did not weep. He did not collapse into remorse. He asked indirectly whether a priest could do something about the feeling that he was being watched. The priest told him the truth a priest must tell in that moment. The first thing that needed to be done was repentance. Not a performance, not a charm, an honest admission of guilt and a request for mercy. Without that, you can ask for relief, but you are still holding the door open from the inside. Frank did not like that answer. He ended the meeting early. In the weeks after, the diocese arranged one final prayer service before the property was sold. It was not a public event. It was for those who had been involved and those who had suffered. A small altar was set up in what used to be room 6. The priest offered Mass quietly, with Father Michael assisting. The prayers were for the dead, for the living, for protection, for healing, for forgiveness. Emily attended and sat near the back, hands folded so tightly her knuckles paled. Jenna sat beside her, not because they were friends in the ordinary way, but because shared survival creates a bond that does not require small talk. Sarah stood near the door, not writing, just watching, with the posture of someone who has finally learned that some moments should be witnessed with reverence rather than recorded. Trooper Luis stood outside at first, then came in during the final blessing. He removed his hat and bowed his head, and for the first time since the case reopened, he allowed himself to look directly at the bathroom door without the urge to turn away. After the Mass, the priest walked to the hook behind the door and removed it. It was a small act, almost mundane, like fixing a broken fixture, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. A place that had been shaped into a tool was being stripped of that shape, not because hardware has power on its own, but because symbols matter. And for years, that hook had been a symbol of a lie. They took it out of the wall and placed it in a bag to be discarded properly, not kept as a relic, not sold as a curiosity. The church does not collect trophies from evil, it removes them. Outside, the desert wind moved through the weeds along the curb. The sky over the highway looked endless and indifferent, the way it always does. Life went on. And still, even after the prayers, even after the arrest, even after the closure, there remained an aftertaste in the file, one final detail that did not fit neatly into legal outcomes. A highway worker, months later, reported a moment at the demolition site. He had been inside the remaining shell of the building, pulling old wiring, when he felt a sudden wave of sadness that did not seem to belong to him. It was heavy, specific, like grief with a shape. He stepped outside, sat on a concrete block, and for a few minutes could not breathe well. He said it felt like a hand pressing down between his shoulder blades. He told his supervisor he needed water. He walked toward his truck, and as he reached for the door handle, he insisted he heard a soft phrase at his ear, not a command, not an invitation. Not the cold logic of despair, a warning, do not stay here. He left the site for the day. He was embarrassed by it. He did not mention it until someone else asked him why. He looked shaken. He said he didn't know. He said he just knew he had to go. When I read that, I did not treat it as proof of anything. I treated it as a reminder that places marked by repeated harm do not become neutral overnight. Healing can be immediate in one sense and gradual in another. The church prays, and God acts, but human wounds still take time to close. Trauma has momentum. Fear has inertia. And in rare cases, the enemy lingers at the edges, hoping for another opening, hoping for another person who will believe the lie that there is only one way out. That is why the most important part of this story is not the hook, the mirror, the moving door, or the old motel's shadow. The most important part is what happened inside people. A woman in despair chose to pick up a phone instead of picking up death. A victim chose to fight for breath and live. A priest chose to name the pattern and confront it without spectacle. A reporter chose truth over sensationalism. A trooper chose to reopen a file everyone else wanted closed. And a woman who had been silent chose to confess what she knew, even at the cost of her marriage and her safety. If you want to understand how darkness loses, it loses like that, not all at once with fireworks. It loses in a series of small refusals, human beings choosing truth, choosing responsibility, choosing life. Because despair is never just a feeling, it is a temptation. And the antidote is not merely optimism. The antidote is communion, people standing together in the light, telling the truth out loud, and refusing to let a lie be the final word.